Hello, it's Jacqueline Kent here, and I'm going to talk to you about my biography of Vida Goldstein, who was the first woman who stood for a national parliament anywhere in the world. In Australia in 1903, for the Senate in Victoria. But before I begin, I'd like to pay tribute to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation on whose land I am sitting, and pay tribute to their leaders, past, present, and emerging. Right. Now, it's a really good time to be talking to you about this because really it's considering that the last 2 or 3 days have caused these seismic events and these marches in all the capital cities and smaller cities in Australia about women's treatment of women. I think that basically Vida would not have been surprised in any way. I really don't think she would. And the reasons for that I'll get on to as we go on. But first of all, I better introduce Vida and tell you who she was, tell you a bit about her. Some of you probably heard of her actually. You might even know that she was the first person to nominate to stand for a national parliament anywhere in the world in 1903. And she's usually mentioned for this in histories of Australian women, of which there are now many, as if this is the most important thing about her. Well, it is pretty important, but at the same time, it's kind of, well, saying it's important, it's more or less saying that it's kind of like a pub trivia question. You know, who was the first woman in the world to stand for Parliament? Vida Goldstein in Victoria in 1903, which is perfectly okay, but once you get into it, it's a little more interesting than that. Basically, she stood for Parliament in the Senate and the House of Representatives 5 times between 1903 and 1917. That was in 1903 and 1910. She stood for the Senate. She stood for the House of Reps in 1913 and twice in 1917. So women had been given the vote in 1902, which is the second nation in the world after New Zealand, as you probably all know, because it's that was 1894 that New Zealand women got the vote. So why didn't an Australian woman, given the fact that this had happened, why did it take 40 years for an Australian woman to get into Parliament? That is another question that I think we can address as we go along. Okay, but first of all, I suppose the other thing to say is, why write a biography of Vida Goldstein? Well, there was already a biography of Vida. It was published in 1993 and it was written by Jeanette Bomford. It was published by Melbourne University Press. And I have to say I used it extensively in writing my book, although it's a very different beast. It's a full-length biography. It's chronologically very exact, which is was very helpful to me. But I thought that it was necessary to do another biography of her. Mostly, there were several reasons, really. First of all, between 1993 and 2018, say, we'd had a woman prime minister. And so that fact and what it said about feminism and women in parliament is a very interesting spin-off for what it says about progress for women in parliament since 1902. And I wrote a biography of Julia Gillard about, where are we, 1910, 20, hang on, about 12 years ago now. And so I thought that what we've seen play out over the last couple of weeks with women's marches and all that that implies, actually is quite logical from the time of Vida's work. Okay. And so, of course, one of the things I wanted to do was not just tell the story of Vida and her career, but to draw parallels between women in public life then and now. And I don't think I'm going to astonish anybody when I say that the progress that has been made is somewhat less than one could have hoped. I mean, people wouldn't be marching in Martin Place or, wherever else they were marching if that were not the case. So, the other reason for writing a biography of Vida Goldstein is the fact that all the biographies that I've heard, that I've read, seem to stop in about 1919, which is when she stopped being a public figure. But she died. She died at the age of 80, and she was born in 1869. So she died in 1949. Now that is quite a long time. It's 40 years. That really, or hang on, 38 years or something. And that's 38 years of a life that have not been adequately excuse me, adequately accounted for in any biography I'd read. And there was something like embarrassment, although I think that may be too strong a word, about Vida's life at the end of her public career. This is probably because she was intensely religious. And in fact, she was a very strong and dedicated Christian Scientist. She joined Christian Science about 1906, I think, 1906 or 1907. But the point is that if she was a dedicated Christian Scientist and she spent all that time being one, the chances are it was pretty important to her, in which case it is something that any conscientious biographer really does need to have a look at. So I really needed to look for this biography in what Vida did after she stopped being a public figure, and how important her religion was to her, and what else happened to her. So that's what this book does as well. Now, I won't go into much detail about her life history because it's all in the book, and you can read it for yourselves. But I will make a few points that the times that she lived through, particularly when she came to young adulthood, which is the turn of the 20th century, 19th century, turn of the 20th century, it was a time when women's issues were very, very much alive. And now this was interesting for me to find out because I'd assumed, I think, that 70s feminists had really started agitation for women's issues. This is absolutely not the case. Before women got the vote, there was a huge agitation for women's suffrage, and that was all across Australia. The fact that women were given the vote federally by Act of Parliament makes you think, oh, well, that was that. I mean, we don't have to worry about it then. We didn't have to worry about it then, did we? Not so, because the question was, having got this right, what were women going to do with it and how were they going to use it? And Vida was very much at the forefront of those questions. Also at the forefront of agitation to give women in Victoria the state vote. And that's another fascinating little story because women got the vote federally, and in every state and territory of Australia, they had it by about 1906, 506, except in Victoria. And this really made Vida furious because Victoria had been the colony. It wasn't a state before 1900, it was a colony. But that was the colony that had started the whole women's issues thing really the agitation before anybody else had really, had a go at it. And so the fact that Victoria was the last state to give women the state vote was absolutely appalling for many people, including, of course, for Vida. So part of the story is her agitation to talk around the upper house, actually, the Victorian upper house, um, which was actually occupied by landowners and, people, gentry, the gentry, men, always men, of course, who had land and influence, which actually made me consider a question I hadn't considered before writing this book. And that was basically what a thing it was for men to allow women the vote. What it was being, what they were being asked to do, and they did by Act of Parliament and so on, mostly. What they were being asked to do was to recognise women as equal partners in politics, in political life, with equal rights to those of men. And the right, of course, was the right to stand for Parliament, which, of course, Vida and several other women at the same time, I'm bound to say. She was merely the first. She was the first to put up a hand. There were other women who stood for Parliament in that 1903 election. So the whole thing of giving women the vote, women being granted the vote, caused an enormous upset because men were now being asked to give women the kind of equality that they'd never even considered. Most of them had never even considered. Okay, we can fast forward to 2021 and there are parallels there. So anyway, getting back to Vida's early life, which I do want to get on to, she had the most extraordinary parents. Her mother was new Victorian squattocracy. She was born in Portland, and that's where her mother was born too, I think. And her mother came from a family of squattocracy, but it was a very kind of odd and very new squattocracy family in 1869. And there were a lot of rather disturbing undercurrents in that family. And her mother, Vida's mother, Isabella, who is a secondary heroine of this book, I might tell you, because Isabella's fantastic. Isabella was desperate to get away. She wanted to start a new life. She wanted to make a difference to society. She was the daughter of a rich family, but she did not want simply to be a rich woman, doing just living in the Western District with tea parties and all that sort of thing, and marrying somebody suitable, chosen possibly by her parents, who would be, would bring forth more children and we'd all live happily ever after. So what she did was she actually married a guy called Jacob Goldstein, who was a shopkeeper in Portland. Jacob was Jewish from an Irish background, but interestingly enough, he never made a big deal about being Jewish. I don't know, not very much is known about him, whether there was quite a lot of anti-Semitism in Ireland when he was a young man, but it's not known whether he suffered from that. He was born in Belfast and he came out to Australia at the age of 19 and left his family forever. He and Isabella understood each other as outliers from their various backgrounds. And that was their bond, I think. And so what they did was they got together, they got married in Portland, and they brought up 5 children, of whom Vida was the eldest. But like a lot of immigrants, they had a lot they needed to prove. They felt they needed to prove. And so Vida managed to get a really good education. Her father, by the way, Jacob, as far as I know, wasn't very well educated, but he got jobs in the Victorian Public Service when they moved to Melbourne from Portland, which is what they did. and he basically kept the family going. And Vita went to PLC, which was very new at that stage, but still wanted to be a prestigious place for the daughters of intelligent daughters of gentlefolk, which in fact it was. They wanted to set up, the man who set up PLC envisaged it as a kind of a female Eton or Harrow, or somewhere where learning and the classics would be very much needed and very much celebrated. Anyway, so Vida went to school there, and her mother did a lot of social work and a lot of work in the community. Now, this is where Vida got her view of the community, and this is how she got her organisational ability from her mother, really, because her mother helped set up with the Reverend Charles Strong, who set up the Australian Church, which the family, having been Presbyterians, belonged to. But she helped set up Australia's first creche in the factory area of Collingwood, which was pretty dire in the 1890s. And she helped her mother collect signatures for a great women's suffrage petition presented to the Victorian Parliament in 1891. So it took nearly 20 years for them to get the vote after that. She was 22. Vida was 22 at the time. And she and her mother were very heavily involved in setting up the Queen Victoria Hospital, which was the first hospital by and for women, certainly in Victoria, probably in Australia. It had a model in England. So her mentor was a woman named Annette Bear Crawford, who died prematurely, and Vida stepped in as the leader of the women's movement in Victoria. And her view about suffrage when women got the vote, when they got the vote in 1902, she believed that conditions would never improve for women or children until women got in there and told men what they needed to know about women and children, because she found it ridiculous that men were making laws for the benefit of women and children when they knew absolutely nothing about what women and children needed. So when she first stood for Parliament in 1903, she was a bit of a novelty. And I have to say that I got really irritated reading about this, because all these reams and reams of newsprint about what a dainty little thing, dainty was a very 1903 word, very dainty little person she was, and her elegant hats, and oh, she was so pretty, and all that sort of stuff. And, you wish that was not so, and you sort of think, well, we've come very far since then. Well, not really. It's not all that far from Vida's fetching bonnets and Julie Bishop's red shoes, or Julia Gillard's haircut, or her blazers, or her clothing, and the criticism that was doled out to that. So that was a bit dispiriting, the fact that hasn't changed much. When she stood for the Senate, she got 51,497 votes. That's in the state of Victoria. And that was just half of what the most successful candidate got. And I think, and I've done a bit of work on this, but it tells me that had she stood in the Senate now, she probably would have got in. In fact, more than likely, she would have got in, because the rules were very different then. But the reason she gave for not succeeding was, quote, "I had against me the combined power of the Morning and Labour papers, deliberate misrepresentation by two of them, lack of finance, and the prejudice of sex. I stood for the cause of women and children. And the chief lesson to be learned from the campaign, she thought, was the need for organisation, which doesn't really explain why then, and for her four subsequent attempts to get into Parliament, she stood as an independent. Now, a lot of people now think, well, of course she didn't, because she should have stood for the Labor Party, because that was more or less her platform. There were two or three pretty good reasons why she didn't, and in fact why other women who stood for Parliament at about the same time, up until about 1943, in fact, why women who did that did not stand for a party. That was, first of all, look, the Labor Party wasn't exactly putting up its hand to have her join them, firstly. And secondly, she had some very trenchant things to say about party politics. And she said the problem with party politics is that you can't be independent, you can't cross the floor if you don't want to, and really you have to toe the party line. And that, that's why she decided firmly that she was going to stand as an independent. Well, let's look at things today. How different or not is that? So she was kind of ahead of her time, or her time hasn't changed. You could put that aside, I guess. But on the hustings, she was witty. She was extremely funny. And one of my favourite quotes is where she was giving a talk somewhere in a country town in Victoria, and someone said to her, yelled out, "Don't you wish you were a man?" And she fired back, "Don't you wish you were?" Which I've always thought was rather nice. So she could have actually given Paul Keating and Robert Menzies, who were supposed to be our great parliamentary orators, if you read her speeches, you reckon she gave them the run for their money, because she was a very clear, very trenchant, very witty speaker. And if she'd ask for questions and people didn't put up their hands, she'd say, "All right, well, let me ask you a few questions." And so she asked them questions too. She was very, I don't know how she got those skills. I think she was just born with them. But she honed them very, very effectively. And anyway, she travelled Victoria when she didn't get in. This is interesting too. When she didn't get in the first time, she travelled around Victoria giving a series of lectures, which she called "The Humour and Pathos of My Senate Campaign." Now, this was actually what they call limelight pictures, which is a very early form of, PowerPoint, and showing all the numerous cuttings and all the numerous cartoons that Punch and the Bulletin had subjected her to, and some of them were pretty disgusting. I mean, it's pretty sexist stuff. But it reminded me of the time that Sarah Hanson-Young, the Green senator, about 2012, I think, on Facebook, I think she was, actually read out all the things that the trolls had been saying about her on Facebook and elsewhere, and screamed with laughter at them. Vita had exactly the same impulse, just to ridicule people, to ridicule her opponents. She didn't always. She was usually pretty polite, and she thanked her opponents when she continued to be unsuccessful. She was always very ladylike. She lost her temper a few times, but she was never less than measured, which I think says volumes for her self-control, myself, as you'll probably discover. Okay, the last few times she stood for Parliament was during World War I, and she stood as a pacifist and an independent. So it's hardly surprising that the last time she did, she lost her deposit. But the courage, this is what I found really interesting, even more interesting, I think, than her parliamentary campaigns in the early days. What was really interesting to me was the fact that she was incredibly courageous. She and her colleagues, who included her colleagues, who included Adela Pankhurst, who was the problem Pankhurst, who came and settled in Australia. Her mother sort of said, one Adela is one Adela too many. And Vita's great friend, Cecilia John. The three of them went around singing songs like I didn't raise my son to be a soldier, and giving pacifist speeches. I can imagine how that went down in the early days. And as the war got worse and more awful, so did the resistance to what Vida was saying. She was very anti both conscription referenda that Billy Hughes put up in 1916 and 1917. And in fact, she took great pride in the fact that they were both defeated. And I think possibly she had a bit to do with that herself. Even though the resistance she had was, as far as I can work out, mainly from men. Okay, so after the war, she travelled. She became very interested in international geopolitics. And she said a few things that were really quite interesting when she travelled to Europe. One of them was that she thought there would be another war in 20 years' time. And that was because she could see that World War II would be a continuation of World War I, mainly because of the horrors of the Treaty of Versailles and the things it didn't do and what didn't happen is because of that. That I found a really interesting part of the book to write as well, because I didn't know anything about that. But her papers are in the Millicent Fawcett Library, which is part of the London School of Economics. And thanks to the wonders of Dropbox is a very good thing, I managed to get access to all her papers, which included a lot of writing about how she thought the 20th century was going to unfold. Like a lot of other people, she thought that the Russian Revolution was fabulous and would cause great improvements and great things would happen. She died in 1948 before any of that didn't come to pass, which is, as we know, we didn't. But she really was, what I found fascinating about her was that she was really, why I've called this book A Woman, this is why I call this book A Woman for Our Time, because she was interested in all the things that intelligent women of an outward bent are interested in now. She never married, she never had children, but she was very much engaged in the world she moved in. And the other reason, Woman of Our Time, also was rather a depressing one, because I had to write an epilogue saying, so how different are we? Well, I think we can judge that for ourselves, actually. I think we have, as I said before, we've come a lot less far than than she probably thought we were going to, although she made no bones about it. Her writings show that she knew that it wasn't just men who disliked what she was doing. Quite a lot of women didn't follow her either. And that proved to be quite significant in her political career. So for the last 20, 30 years, she was a Christian Science practitioner, which meant that she was very much involved in the community that she belonged to. She was very much involved in doing what could be called, I suppose, pastoral work. She would talk to people about their problems, and when she died, when she wrote her will, she described herself as a Christian Science practitioner, which is what I think she felt was the most successful thing that she had done. But she is really important because of all the reasons that I've been outlining. She is such a bridge between women then and women now. Furthermore, she was a really good writer. She's very funny, and I became very fond of her, actually. I liked the way her mind worked, which is why I managed, I suppose, to spend 3 years working with her. But anyway, before I go, I'd just like to talk about a couple of other things. First of all, sources. As I said, there was a biography of her, and also her books and her things in the Millicent Fawcett Library. There's also photographs and copies of her pamphlets and other writings in La Trobe Library and the National Library and in Sydney's Mitchell Library. So Of course, those of us who do a lot of work in history, of course, are very well up with Trove, which is the most magnificent resource run by the National Library. It's a digitized version of old newspapers, and there was an enormous amount I found out about Vida from there. But as I say, there were silences in the records. There was very little about her, very little about her religious beliefs, and she really believed that her work was the most important thing about her life. There were very few personal letters. I think she kept everything very much for the work. And she was, yeah, there's another question. Somebody asked me about her hostility towards political parties. And where did that come from? And did she run into conflict between her aversion to the party machine and the growing professionalisation of her own political activities? Which is a very good question. And in fact, I think she inherited her hostility to organised politics from her father, Jacob. Jacob was one of these people who didn't mind organisations provided he was running them. And she insisted on being an independent because she thought that gave her greater flexibility, which I think it obviously did. Okay, now I think I've said enough about Vida at the moment, and if anybody's got any questions, I'll be happy to try and answer them. But thank you for listening.